Welcome the awakened ones. Never mistake a serene surface for shallow depths. Some of the most profound souls navigate life with quiet grace and possess an unwavering strength that emerges when necessary. They underestimated you. They saw your patience as passivity, your kindness as naivete, your silence as a blank canvas upon which they could paint their deceptions. But they were profoundly mistaken. The quiet one held within them a resilience, a power that would become the very storm they could not weather. And when the tide shifted, it surged with such force that it shattered their carefully constructed facades. Consider this: psychological research reveals that manipulators often target individuals they perceive as exceptionally kind, believing them to be easily controlled. In essence, they saw your inner light and thought, "This will be an effortless victory." Instead, they stumbled into a spiritual reckoning, a battle on the most challenging terrain. This is not about seeking petty revenge. It is about the exquisite and terrifying reality of underestimating a soul chosen for something greater. You were not the loudest voice in the room. You weren't driven by confrontation. Yet you were always observing, always discerning. And when you acted, it wasn't with a roar, but with precise and deliberate action. Prepare yourself, because we are about to unveil the truth of what transpired when they, in their arrogance, assumed you were a mere pawn, only to discover that you were the architect orchestrating the entire game from the outset. Let's begin. First, they misinterpreted your emotional intelligence as a vulnerability until it became the very weapon that dismantled their manipulations. They dismissed you as weak because of your profound empathy, because you could sense subtle shifts in energy, understand the unspoken dynamics within a room, and perceive details that others overlooked. They scoffed at your emotional intelligence, deeming it a soft, inconsequential trait. However, the reality is that your emotional intelligence was the most formidable strength you possessed. And they walked blindly into its embrace, believing you to be too gentle to recognize their true intentions. While they were plotting to manipulate you, you were already deciphering their motives. You didn't react impulsively because you were carefully observing. You didn't engage in fruitless arguments because you were striving to understand. This is what disoriented them. You didn't retaliate in the ways they anticipated. You didn't erupt in anger, expose their schemes, or plead for understanding. You simply acknowledged the truth, saw it with unwavering clarity, and allowed it to mature. This silence, this composure, was not born of fear, but of calculated strategy. You were gathering evidence, not just tangible receipts, but spiritual evidence. And once you had accumulated sufficient insight, you acted with quiet determination, with unwavering strength, and with little or no advance warning. They failed to recognize that you possessed the ability to manage your emotions without allowing them to distort your judgment. You were adept at detecting insincere apologies, manipulative acts of kindness, and fabricated displays of loyalty. And because you didn't always immediately expose them, they assumed you were oblivious. But you saw everything. You allowed them to reveal their patterns. You allowed them to repeat the same cycles. And while they were under the illusion that you were falling prey to their schemes, you were meticulously documenting their actions within your soul. You provided them with opportunities to change, not because you were desperate for them to do so, but because you wanted to witness if they were capable of growth. Then they were not. And when they ultimately crossed the final boundary, you were already 10 steps ahead. You didn't require closure. You didn't need definitive proof. You already possessed absolute clarity. When you finally asserted yourself, they were stunned, not because you lost control, but because you surpassed them in every way. You didn't descend to their level. You simply walked away with your integrity intact, and this deeply humiliated them. This is the aspect they will never openly admit. They were unprepared for someone who could feel so deeply and yet walk away so decisively. You were not the fool. You were the master strategist who allowed them to believe they were in control until the very moment they weren't. Second, they engaged in games with someone who had not only read the rule book but had also rewritten it entirely. They believed they were outsmarting you, that they were manipulating you as if you were a simpleton pulling the strings from the shadows, confident that you couldn't possibly keep pace with their tactics. What they failed to grasp was that while they were engrossed in their games, you were diligently studying their patterns. You weren't bewildered. You were accumulating information. Every subtle insult, every calculated maneuver, every insincere smile served only to expose their true selves. They were convinced that they had you cornered, that they were the ones dictating the terms. But the truth is, you had already transcended the level on which they were operating. You saw through their charade even before they made their initial move. They didn't realize that they were dealing with someone who had encountered genuine manipulation before, someone who had emerged from trials by fire, not embittered but sharpened. You weren't naive. You were keenly observant. You allowed them to believe they held the advantage, but deep down you were poised to overturn the entire game. The reason they persisted in attempting to manipulate you is because they were projecting their own susceptibility to being deceived. They assumed you would succumb to attention, flattery, guilt trips, or tactics of control, because those were the very methods they employed. But they overlooked a fundamental detail: you were not designed for superficial games. You were not swayed by hollow displays of power. You were already operating at a level where authenticity was the currency, not manipulation. What compounded their frustration was that you didn't expose their game with dramatic flair. You didn't broadcast their transgressions to the world. You simply and quietly withdrew. And in that silence, they lost all sense of control, because now they knew that you had allowed them to believe they were winning, just long enough for them to ensnare themselves in their own web of deceit. They underestimated you because you didn't flaunt your strength, because you weren't ostentatious, because you had no need to prove anything. Ultimately, they came to the realization that they were dealing with someone who wasn't even playing the same game. While they were preoccupied with strategizing for short-term gains, you were focused on cultivating long-term alignment. You weren't seeking revenge. You were creating space for peace. And when you walked away, they finally comprehended that the most potent form of power is the kind that never requires external validation. Third, they wagered on your silence, failing to recognize that it was strategic, not submissive. They mistook your silence for ignorance. They truly believed that because you weren't reacting, you were unaware, that you lacked the courage to speak up or the strength to push back. But what they failed to understand is that your silence was not a sign of weakness. It was a demonstration of intelligence. It was an act of self-control. You were fully aware of what was happening, but you chose not to expend your energy attempting to convince people who had already revealed their true nature. They relentlessly tested your patience, encroaching upon your boundaries, attempting to provoke a reaction from you, so that they could distort the narrative and portray you as the problem. But you refused to play into their hands. You remained silent because you knew that once you spoke, the truth would inflict more pain than anything they could possibly endure. You weren't trying to win arguments. You were observing them as they exposed their own flaws. They hoped that you would react emotionally so that they could label you as dramatic, irrational, or unstable. But instead, you responded with nothing, no outburst, no explanation, just pure, calculated silence. And this unsettled them deeply because those who thrive on chaos despise it when you deny them the reaction they crave. You starved them of the drama they sought. You robbed them of the control they craved. That silence was your way of reclaiming your power without even lifting a finger. They believed they had time to continue lying, manipulating, and exploiting you. But you were never confused. You were simply patient. You weren't fooled by their lies, you were documenting them, and when you finally detached yourself, it seemed sudden to them, but to you it was a planned and calculated move. You were never lost in the fog of their deceit. You simply allowed them to believe that you were, so that they would continue to reveal the depths to which they were willing to sink. What is truly remarkable is that they are now angry at you for not participating in their games, furious that you didn't scream, argue, or plead, because those reactions would have indicated that you still cared. But your silence conveyed everything. You saw it, you accepted it, you moved on. This is what torments them now. They cannot comprehend how the person they believed they had under their control is now someone they cannot reach, cannot understand, and cannot manipulate any longer. You didn't become silent because you lost. You became silent because you had already won. Fourth, they mocked your kindness, failing to realize that you were a storm cloaked in a smile. They perceived your kindness as a joke. Each time you extended grace to them, they assumed you were oblivious to their actions. They mistook your patience for ignorance, assuming that because you chose to remain calm, you had no limits because you didn't retaliate. You were incapable of doing so because you loved with gentleness, you lacked power. But they never paused to consider why someone like you possessed such self-control. Why you didn't resort to underhanded tactics, why you chose peace over pride. It wasn't because you were naive. It wasn't because you were afraid. It was because you were disciplined. You had witnessed destruction before, and you understood how easily one could become the very thing that had inflicted pain upon them. This is why you remained graceful even when they disrespected you. This is why you smiled even when they attempted to provoke you. You weren't ignoring their behavior, you were testing their character, and they failed that test miserably. They continued to push, mock, and test your boundaries as if you were too meek to ever reach your breaking point. But what they failed to recognize is that your silence was not an act of surrender. It was an act of mercy. You were giving them space to correct their behavior, time to grow. But the more you restrained yourself, the more they indulged in the illusion that you were powerless until you were not. There is always a breaking point. And when they crossed that line, everything they believed about you crumbled. That sweet, calm, and generous version of you that they thought they controlled vanished, not because you transformed into someone else, but because you finally ceased shrinking to accommodate their insecurities. And it struck them with tremendous force, not with shouting or vengeance, but with the undeniable presence of someone who had finally recognized their worth and acted accordingly. The same smile that once provided them with comfort suddenly became a warning. The storm didn't announce its arrival, it had been smiling all along. Now they accuse you of being cold, changed, unrecognizable. But the truth is, you were always powerful. You simply preferred to lead with love. They mocked your kindness. Now they are haunted by the calm before the storm because they never anticipated the lightning that was to come. Fifth, they assumed your loyalty was synonymous with blindness, but you were observing them the entire time. They believed that your loyalty meant you were incapable of seeing the truth. They assumed that because you stood by them, defended them, forgave them, and continued to show up, you must have been blind to their actions. They truly believed that they were deceiving you, but what they failed to recognize is that you weren't blind. You were watching everything. You noticed the subtle lies. You sensed the shifts in energy. You observed how their words contradicted their actions. You heard what they said when they believed you weren't listening. You watched how they behaved when your back was turned. And even though your intuition was screaming, you didn't immediately walk away, not because you were lost, but because you were testing them. You wanted to see if they were capable of growth, if they would take responsibility for their actions, if they would value your loyalty and strive to reciprocate it. You hoped that love, patience, and consistency might inspire them to change. But deep down, you already knew the truth. You simply needed them to show you one last time who they truly were so that you could walk away without any doubts, guilt, or second guessing. They believed that they were taking advantage of you. They thought that your loyalty was a weakness they could exploit. But they failed to understand that your loyalty was not rooted in ignorance. It was rooted in choice. And once you chose to cease giving, cease explaining, and cease showing up, there was no turning back. When you walked away, you didn't leave broken or embittered. You left with clarity, with all the emotional evidence you had been collecting in silence, with your integrity intact, with your power fully reclaimed, and with the peace of mind that came from knowing you had given them every opportunity to do what was right and they still chose to do wrong. Now they are scrambling, confused, and trying to comprehend how they lost someone so loyal. But the truth is, they lost you the moment they mistook your loyalty for stupidity. They toyed with a heart that was watching everything from the sidelines. And when you finally stepped away, it wasn't driven by emotion, it was driven by finality. You were never blind, you were simply loyal on purpose. And once your purpose shifted, so did your presence forever. Sixth, they assumed that your spiritual path made you an easy target for manipulation. They assumed that your spiritual beliefs made you soft, that because you spoke of divine love, healing, and forgiveness, you were someone they could exploit without facing any consequences. In their minds, you were a safe target, too loving to confront them, too forgiving to hold them accountable, and too peaceful to defend yourself. They heard you speak of grace and assumed that you didn't know how to expose a lie. They observed your faith and mistook it for fragility. But what they failed to realize is that your spirituality didn't make you weak. It made you wise. You weren't walking around with your head in the clouds. You were grounded in truth, fully awake and deeply aware. You weren't simply existing, you were discerning. You sensed everything in the spiritual realm before it manifested in the physical realm. And while they were under the illusion that they were deceiving you, you had already seen them in prayer. You didn't react impulsively because you were waiting. You didn't confront them immediately because you were listening to your intuition, to the divine guidance within you, to your higher self. And when the time came to act, you did so with precision, not out of rage, but from divine revelation. You didn't need to erupt in anger, you simply allowed the truth to cut through their lies. They believed you were harmless because you led with love, but love doesn't equate to being a doormat. Love sets boundaries. Love declares, I will not allow you to dishonor my spirit while I am striving to elevate yours. They underestimated this aspect of your being. They anticipated submission, but what they encountered was spiritual authority. You knew when to engage in intercession, but you also knew when to engage in spiritual warfare. You knew when to turn the other cheek, and you knew when to stand your ground. You weren't seeking to destroy anyone, but you also weren't going to allow them to destroy you. They assumed that your path required you to shrink, but it was the very thing that taught you how to rise. And now that they have witnessed the other side of you, the protective, powerful, and discerning side, they are silent not because you have changed, but because you have finally revealed what you had been withholding all along. Spiritual doesn't mean stupid. Spiritual means you perceive the unseen and still choose the perfect moment to act. You don't strike out of revenge. You strike when divine guidance indicates that it is time. Seventh, they exposed themselves by overestimating your ignorance. They believed they were smarter than you, that they were skilled with their words, calculated with their actions, and strategic enough to remain undetected. They were confident that they were 10 steps ahead, as if you were too naive, too slow, or too trusting to ever figure them out. They carried themselves with confidence, believing they were concealing their intentions behind charm, feigned concern, or superficial compliments. But what they failed to grasp was that you already knew. You had already perceived the cracks in their facade. Your spirit sensed what their words attempted to conceal. You noticed the tone, the inconsistencies, and the patterns. You were aware of everything the entire time, but you didn't interrupt their charade. You allowed them to speak. You allowed them to reveal themselves because you understood something they didn't. People eventually expose their true nature if given enough time. You didn't rush to confront them. You didn't panic or attempt to force clarity. You remained silent, observed closely, and allowed them to become comfortable with their lies. The more they believed you were clueless, the bolder they became. And this is when they made their most significant error. Mistaking your silence for confusion instead of confirmation, they continued to talk. and each word tightened the noose around their own deception. They exposed themselves not because you backed them into a corner, but because they were arrogant enough to believe that you weren't watching. They underestimated the depth of your observation, how much you perceived without needing to ask, and how powerful you became when you were already aware and chose not to speak yet. They assumed they were in control, but you were holding the truth the entire time like a quiet weapon. And when everything finally came to light, they looked shocked. Not because the truth was new, but because you had possessed it the entire time and never once indicated that they were performing for someone who had already read the script. You didn't expose them. They exposed themselves. You simply stood there calm, watching them hand-deliver the evidence, because some individuals don't get caught. They unravel. And in their desperate attempt to deceive you, they utterly played themselves. Eighth, they attempted to impart lessons to you from a lower state of consciousness. They truly believed they were enlightening you, that they were the masterminds in the dynamic. They played their petty games, set traps, pushed your buttons, withheld affection, and tested your patience, all because they believed they were teaching you a lesson. They sought to humble you, control you, and show you how the world operates. In their minds, they were in a position of power, believing they were superior to you. But what they failed to understand is that you weren't operating from ego. You were operating from alignment. You didn't meet them with resistance, not because you were weak, but because you recognized that their mindset was beneath the frequency you were called to embody. You perceived their attempts to manipulate, provoke a reaction, and prove a point. But the truth is, they were operating from a place of insecurity, and you recognized this from the beginning. You simply didn't engage because you knew better. You have already traversed through trials by fire. You have already buried aspects of yourself and resurrected with a deeper understanding of the truth. Your wisdom didn't originate from books, trauma bonding, or social games. Your wisdom came from a higher source, and this cannot be taught, faked, or outperformed. They believed you were in need of their guidance, their correction, and their discipline. But you had already survived ordeals that they could never comprehend. You had already healed from wounds that they were still concealing behind their ego. You weren't confused. You were elevated. And this is precisely why they couldn't reach you even when they attempted to diminish you. You weren't being arrogant. You were being awake. You weren't looking down on them. You simply recognized that the games they were playing were symptoms of a mind still trapped in survival mode. While they were preoccupied with attempting to humble you, they failed to notice how truly humble you already were. True humility is not about allowing others to mistreat you. It's about recognizing your worth without needing to proclaim it. This is what confused them. You weren't reacting, and they mistook this as a need to be taught a lesson, failing to realize that you were the lesson. They cannot educate a soul that has been to war and returned with divine clarity. You didn't acquire your wisdom through manipulation. You earned it through surrender, pain healing, and spiritual elevation. And now you move differently because you are different. They attempted to teach you from the ground, but you were already soaring. Ninth, they attempted to provoke your gumwezis, but you showed them that your calm is far more terrifying. They poked, prodded and provoked you, waiting for you to lose control. They wanted a meltdown, a reaction, something loud and messy that they could point to and say, "See, this is who they really are." They attempted everything: silent treatment, mind games, public disrespect, and subtle insults disguised as jokes. All of it was designed to make you lose your composure. They weren't seeking resolution, they were seeking ammunition. They wanted to trigger your crazy so that they could justify their mistreatment of you. They needed you to explode because it would make them appear sane. But what they received instead shook them even more. Your silence, your composure, and your refusal to give them what they desired. You didn't yell. You didn't break down. You didn't descend to their level. You simply looked at them unmoved, as if you already knew how the story would end. And this is when fear began to set in, because they realized that they had no control over you. The calm that they mistook for shutdown was actually clarity. You weren't bottling things up. You were stepping back, measuring, watching, and choosing when and how to respond instead of allowing them to dictate the pace. You showed them the most terrifying truth: you don't need chaos to defend yourself. You don't need to scream to prove your pain. You don't need to attack to protect your peace. That calm, that silence was not passive. It was a decision, a strategy, and it dismantled everything they were attempting to build against you. They expected fireworks. You gave them stillness. They expected drama. You gave them closure without a single argument. And this wounded them more than any explosion could, because nothing is more unsettling to a manipulator than realizing that their tricks no longer work on you. You didn't avoid the conflict because you were afraid. You avoided it because you refused to be their puppet. You chose power over performance. You remained in control of your energy even when they did everything to disrupt it. And now they are trapped in a fruitless effort to provoke a version of you that no longer exists, the one who used to defend yourself at all costs. That version is gone. What they face now is someone who recognizes their own power and protects it with a silence that speaks louder than anything they anticipated. 10th, they forgot that you were a mirror, and they shattered themselves in their attempt to break you. They attacked you with everything they possessed: lies, gaslighting, guilt trips, and manipulation. They projected their insecurities onto you and attempted to burden you with the weight of their own brokenness. Every time they felt small, they tried to diminish you. Every time they felt guilty, they attempted to make you feel responsible. They didn't want to take accountability for their actions, so they cast you as the villain in a narrative they were creating to escape their own self-reflection. What they failed to realize is that you weren't their enemy. You were their mirror. You didn't absorb their chaos, you reflected it back to them. You didn't retaliate with more cruelty. You stood still, clear and honest, and this is what shattered them, because the version of you they attacked never retaliated in the ways they anticipated. You didn't need to lie, distort, or manipulate. You simply upheld the truth. So to wrap it all up, remember that quiet strength isn't weakness, your kindness isn't naivete, and your silence, it's definitely not submission. You possess a depth and resilience that manipulators consistently underestimate, often to their own detriment. You're capable of observing, discerning, and acting with a precision that surpasses their shallow games. They may have thought they were playing you, but in reality they were exposing themselves, revealing patterns, and ultimately handing you the reins to a game you were never truly playing in the first place. You rose above not through revenge or drama, but through unwavering integrity and a clear understanding of your own worth. I'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences on this. Have you ever been in a similar situation? What lessons have you learned about navigating manipulative dynamics? Leave a comment below. I'm really keen to get the discussion going. And if this resonated with you, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on future explorations of inner strength, spiritual awakening, and navigating life with grace and power. See you in the next one, in the next one, in the next one, in the next one, in the next